Hello, my name is Simon Holloway. I'm the Manager of Adult Education and Academic Engagement here at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. And I'd like to speak a little bit today about Nazi readings of the rabbinic literature. I want to look at ways in which texts like the Talmud were used and misused within German propaganda in the Third Reich. And I don't want to assume any background knowledge on the part of those who are watching this video, so I would like to start with two brief introductions, the first of which will explain what I mean by rabbinic literature, what texts like the Talmud actually are, and the second of which will seek to contextualize that German propaganda within a longer history of anti-Talmudic polemic. When we speak about sacred literature within a Jewish context, most often what people have in mind is what we refer to as the Torah. When the Torah gets read liturgically in a synagogue environment, it gets read from a scroll, as you see here, and the word Torah simply means instruction. And according to conventional wisdom, traditionally Jews have believed that that what we refer to as the Torah was a revelation given from God to Moses, that Moses wrote the Torah down, and as a result, we refer to it as the written Torah. And we call it the written Torah in order to differentiate it from another body of instruction that Moses was also believed to have been given by God, but a body of instruction that he was not to write down. This was a Torah that he was to pass on orally, that he was to pass on verbally, and we refer to it, therefore, as the oral Torah, and we call it the oral Torah even after such a time as it begins to be committed to writing. And when the oral Torah is committed to writing, it's committed to writing in a few different forms. It's committed to writing in the form of what we refer to as midrash. Midrash means a creative exposition. Midrash takes legal passages and narratives from the biblical literature, not just the Torah, but the Hebrew Bible as a whole, and expands upon them and develops them, fills silences within the texts, and might serve the purpose of deepening character motivation, for example. And when the oral law gets written down, it also gets written down in the form of what we refer to as the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a larger, multi-volume legal code written in Hebrew that contains within its pages an elucidation and elaboration on all of the laws that are found within the Torah itself. Midrash and Mishnah are both further amplified and further developed in the most significant oral law composition, which is that of the Talmud. And the Babylonian Talmud in particular contains a great many examples of midrash within its pages, but also features an intensive series of discussions and elaborations on the laws that are found within the Mishnah, and serves, in a lot of respects, as the foundation for a rabbinic legal system. Inasmuch as it serves as a foundation for the rabbinic legal system, what we refer to as the halakha, it also therefore has been further developed in later legal treatments. So, for example, in the 12th century, we have the collection known as the Mishneh Torah, which is in 14 volumes, written by Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, who is known in Hebrew as the Rambam, in English known often by his Greek name as Maimonides, which features a synthesis of all of the laws found within the Talmud. And in the 16th century, to mention just one other example, Rabbi Yosef Karo produced what is known as the Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch presents all of those laws from the Talmud that are relevant in today's day and age. In the 16th century, those laws that are still observed by Jewish people. And inasmuch as there is a long history of a Christian antipathy towards rabbinic literature that has often been taken out not only on the Talmud itself, but also on these legal codes. And one way in which some Christian scholars responded to these texts was in the form of censorship. So, for example, to share with you a page from the Shulchan Aruch, you can see where the medieval censor has daubed the lines with black ink in order to excise those sections that might offend Christian sensibilities. And this is a distinctly medieval response to offensive texts. While it's still possible to control to some degree exactly what gets printed and how things get disseminated, a censor may choose to cut things out. There's an irony to this, of course, which is that sometimes the ink that was used by the censors was of a less durable substance than was the ink with which these texts were printed, and has faded over time, becoming a kind of highlighter that draws the eye to passages that the Church at various points throughout its history found problematic. But it also resulted in texts being printed in an abridged form. So, as an example, if we have a look at a page, a modern-day printing of the Talmud, you can see the Talmudic passage there in the middle of the page, and arranged around the margins are various commentaries. And you can see that there is a tendency to really fill every square inch of the page. And this is from Tractate Sanhedrin. But if we turn the page, we actually find, as you should hopefully be able to see on the screen, that page that is on the viewer's left has quite a large amount of blank space there at the bottom. And that's because there is a section that had been removed from this text. And this is one of a number of different sections within the Talmud that had been excised by Christian censors. In this instance, a passage that concerns the execution of Jesus and some of his disciples, viewed as offensive and problematic by Christian censors who simply removed it. But while this is a distinctly medieval response to texts that are viewed as offensive or problematic, with the further proliferation of printing and the further dissemination of printed literature, it ceases to be possible to really control that which gets disseminated. And people need to find alternate means of drawing the public's attention to passages that might be deemed problematic. And this brings us to the 18th century, and to the work in particular of one man, a German Orientalist by the name of Johann Andreas Eisenmenger. And Eisenmenger, at the beginning of the 18th century, published two very large volumes that he titled Entdecktes Judentum, which means Judaism revealed or Judaism exposed. You can see it's quite a large text. This is the first volume published in 1711. There was a second volume published in 1714. And this provides a lengthy concatenation and analysis of various passages from the Talmud and from other examples of rabbinic literature that Eisenmenger felt Christians should be aware of and should be offended by. It really is something of a litany of mistranslations and misinterpretations that I won't be elaborating on today, because I want to focus specifically on propaganda produced during the Third Reich. But I do want to point out that Eisenmenger did spend a considerable amount of time obtaining familiarity with the languages of rabbinic composition, with Hebrew and with Aramaic. And what he produced here, however problematic it might be in various instances, was genuinely original research and something that later generations of polemicists were very much indebted to. Later generations of polemicists who themselves did not actually engage in that level of research. So, for example, and still in the 19th century now, in 1871, August Rohling produced a very slim volume that was very influential called the Talmud Jude, which means the Talmud Jew. And he's not getting any of this information from the Talmud that he's including in his text. He's getting all of it from Eisenmenger. And the same was the case with Dr. Justus, as he called himself. Dr. Justus, his real name was Aaron Bremen. Aaron Bremen was a Jew who had converted to Catholicism and subsequently to Protestantism and then back again to Catholicism. And such was also the case with Jacob Ecker, who didn't even produce a new title, actually. He used the same title that Dr. Justus had used of Judenspiegel, the Mirror of the Jews. And all the way down, indeed, to the beginning of the 20th century, when we find authors like the Lithuanian priest Justinas Pranaitis, who produced a text, Christianus in Talmud Judaeorum, Christianity in the Jewish Talmud. And he actually testified, Pranaitis actually testified at the trial of a Russian Jew by the name of Menachem Beilis, who stood accused of having murdered a Christian boy for ritual purposes and consumed his blood. And Beilis was acquitted. The charges were trumped up ridiculous charges. But the reason the Pranayedis testified against him is because he was able to present himself as an expert in the Talmud and to claim that he was able to adduce passages within the Talmud that justified the murder of Christian children and the consumption of their blood. And I mention this only by way of pointing out that it became very evident during the trial that Pranayedis actually knew nothing whatsoever about the Talmud, nor did he have the capacity to read the Talmud, but had taken all of his observations from the writings of those who preceded him, people like Jacob Ecker, for example, August Rolling, and of course Johann Andreas Eisenmenger. And this has been a phenomenon down to the present day. It's the reason why, if one was so inclined to do so, if one were to look online for anti-Talmudic polemic, of which there is an abundance, certainly, one would not only find a variety of truly horrific passages supposedly being quoted, but passages that are attributed to texts that don't exist. It's almost like a game of broken telephone. Once Eisenmenger has quoted a text and now somebody else has quoted Eisenmenger and now somebody else has quoted that person as well, by the time it gets down to the English literature of the present day, it can be sometimes very difficult to work out which text it is that they think they are even alluding to, and where is this passage in the text that they claim to be quoting. I want to focus on the writings of Nazi propagandists. And when it came to Nazi propagandists, they were also certainly heir to these other examples of polemical literature as well. But there were those amongst them who were themselves conducting original research. And one of those individuals whom I would like to mention is Johannes Pohl. Johannes Pohl was a German Orientalist. He did a PhD in Messianism in the book of Ezekiel. He spent a period of time studying at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, and he spent a period of time studying also in Jerusalem, where he acquired a familiarity with Hebrew and with Aramaic. In 1941, he published a book called Talmudgeist, which is a Talmud spirit, and that was one of the things that recommended him to the attention of Alfred Rosenberg. Alfred Rosenberg was a very early Nazi Party ideologue. He was one of the individuals who had actually established the Nazi Party, and some of his early writings helped to formulate Nazi ideology, particularly a book of his titled The Myth of the 20th Century that formulated this doctrine of Aryan supremacy. In 1920, he also published a very slim book on the Talmud titled "Immorality in the Talmud," and he took over the editorship of a newspaper, Völkische Beobachter, which is the Folkish Observer. And inasmuch as he was editing a newspaper, he also then had the opportunity to work very closely with the Reichsminister of Propaganda, whose name was Joseph Goebbels. Like Rosenberg, Goebbels was one of 24 people within the Nazi state to hold the title of Reichsleiter. That was the highest a title that a person could hold, second only to that of the Fuhrer himself. And inasmuch as Goebbels was the Minister of Propaganda, he was able to produce films that could be disseminated for a wider audience and to also stage various types of exhibits. So, for example, he put on an exhibit that concerned a Jewish influence in art. And the following year, he put on an exhibit that concerned Jewish influence in music. And Goebbels, of course, also edited a newspaper himself, and the newspaper that he edited was titled Der Angriff, which means the attack. And I'll mention one other newspaper editor who was important for our purposes, and that is Julius Streicher. And Streicher was also a very early member of the Nazi Party, somebody who had joined the Nazi Party at a very, very early stage. And the newspaper that he edited, which was a very popular newspaper, was titled Der Stürmer. Der Stürmer was not only very popular, for reasons that allowed it to become very popular, was also to some people a little bit of an embarrassment. It was viewed as quite lowbrow, and the cartoons within it were oftentimes of a vaguely pornographic nature. And we can see an example here where we have an unclothed woman, perhaps representative of German innocence, being set upon by various snakes on which are emblazoned the names of alleged Jewish sex offenders, with one exception, which is the snake furthest to the left, which says Hirschfeld on it, and that's a reference to Magnus Hirschfeld, who was the Jewish sex researcher. And you can see that all of these snakes are slithering forth from the Talmud. The cartoonist, the individual who did all of the cartoons actually for Der Stürmer, he called himself Phipps, but his name was Philipp Ruprecht. And Ruprecht was tried after the war, and he was given 10 years hard labor. But his boss, the editor of the newspaper, Julius Streicher, was not himself so fortunate. He was tried in Nuremberg. You can see him over here. At Nuremberg, he professed himself to be one of the world's foremost experts on Jews and Judaism. Here he is, just a few seats to his right, Alfred Rosenberg, and the two of them were found guilty and hanged. And this brings us back full circle, actually, to where I started with Johannes Pohl, because Pohl was a long-time contributor to the pages of Der Stürmer, and we will be seeing some examples of his articles in this session. And when we look at the sorts of things that Nazi propagandists were saying, we find that there is something of a hierarchy of interpretations. Okay, there are different ways that a text can be read, different ways that it can be translated, different ways that it can be interpreted. And at the top of that hierarchy, we have things that are translated well and correctly interpreted. And you will no doubt not be surprised, and of course that one off our list, it's not something that we find when it comes to Nazi treatments of the Talmud and the rabbinic literature. What we will find is an abundance of things that are translated well, but misinterpreted in some fashion. And we're actually going to spend most of our time in this session on this one category. But we will, of course, also find things that are mistranslated. They're not actually translated well at all. And I will share with you a couple of examples of this phenomenon. And then finally, we get passages that are simply made up, invented from whole cloth. And that is not perhaps quite as interesting as the other examples, but I'll share with you a few examples here too. And in order to do so, I'd like to start with a quote. And this is a quote from Alfred Rosenberg's book on immorality in the Talmud. Towards the beginning of the book, he declares that we find this methodology of the Talmud perfectly reflected in the state of mind of today's Jewish journalists and lawyers. He's critiquing here what he refers to as the Talmudic method. Okay, the style of Talmudic argumentation. These Jewish lawyers, these Jewish journalists, they follow the Talmud even if they know nothing about it. It is not the Talmud that created the Jews, but the Jews that created the Talmud. It preserved the spirit of the Jewish race unchanged for over 2,000 years. That statement, that it is not the Talmud that created the Jews, but the Jews that created the Talmud, sounds, of course, like a staggeringly banal thing to say. The inverse might sound more profound, that it was not the Jews that created the Talmud, but the Talmud that created the Jews. But what he is here asserting is a very core element of his ideological outlook. That when he suggests that Jews created the Talmud, he means that the Talmud is a manifestation of Jewishness. Thinking of this in biological terms, it is almost like he is suggesting that the Talmud is the Jewish phenotype. It is the expression of the Jewish gene, which means that Jews follow the Talmud even if they don't know it. And as the same idea is expressed in a cartoon in Der Stürmer that Philipp Ruprecht put together, das andere Blut, der andere Geist, which means the Jews are possessed of a different blood, that they are racially distinct and therefore of a different spirit. And texts like the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch are reflections of that spirit. And what this means is that you have license, therefore, to create a passage from the Talmud. You can invent a passage. It doesn't have to be in the Talmud. If that passage is true, if it reflects some reality about the nature of Jews as they are perceived, then it is Talmud in some curious roundabout kind of way. The Talmud is really just a manifestation of Jewishness. So let's have a look at some of the sorts of things that were invented, some of the sorts of passages that were made up. And the three examples that I'm going to share with you here, they all come from a book that was published in the late 1930s, that was published in the German district of Wuppertal, and it has pictures. It features pictures of prominent Jews together with quotes, some of which purport to be from the Talmud. Quotes like, "Non-Jews were created to serve Jews." Quotes like, "When a Jew does business with a non-Jew, he must deceive in measures, weights, and price." And quotes like, "Everywhere, trade is better than handiwork." And I quite like these three quotes because even though they are all of them invented, they run a little bit of a spectrum. So, for example, non-Jews were created to serve Jews. It's a made-up quote. Nowhere does the Talmud say this, but there are passages in the Talmud that were once so inclined, one could interpret as suggestive of this notion. In other words, if there were to be a Jewish person who obnoxiously were to believe this thing, they could no doubt find passages within the rabbinic literature on which to base that idea on. So it is a made-up quote, but on that spectrum of truthiness and relevance, it's not so outlandish a made-up quote. Okay, if one wanted to, one could, as I say, find things that might be suggestive of that notion. But then we have this idea that when a Jew does business with a non-Jew, he must deceive in measures, weights, and price. This is not only a made-up quote, it is flatly contradicted by passages within the Talmud itself. The Talmud places a tremendous emphasis on honesty in business. In fact, the Talmud even suggests that when a person dies and ascends for judgment, the very first question that they are asked is, were you honest in all of your business transactions? And as post-Talmudic texts like the Shulchan Aruch make plainly and unambiguously clear, is that this applies regardless who one is doing business with. So this is a statement that is very much at odds with what the Talmud really says. And then finally we get this quote that everywhere trade is better than handiwork. This one doesn't even register on that sort of truthiness scale. It is so profoundly perplexing a sentiment. It is truly a 20th century prejudice retrojected onto the pages of the Talmud. This idea that trade is better than handiwork would not have made sense as a concept to the authors of the Talmud. Why is there a hierarchical relationship in the first place between trade and handiwork? And the reality is, at the time of the Talmud, Jewish economies were overwhelmingly agricultural. In the Middle Ages, Jewish economies moved more into trade, but there were always handicrafts and textiles as well. By the time we get to the 20th century, in Europe, Jews were so staggeringly disproportionately represented in commerce as to be described sometimes somewhat unflatteringly as a nation of shopkeepers. But the idea that the Talmud itself might suggest that they need to be engaged in trade and in business rather than in manufacturing, it reflects a profound lack of familiarity with the Talmud. So I don't want to spend any more time on this sort of nonsense. Let's actually look at some passages that are within the rabbinic literature, within the Talmud and other related texts, and see how they are mistranslated and misinterpreted. And the first example of a mistranslation is actually one that I would like to share, but it is not one that I have seen in any Nazi-era publication. It is one that we find in the writings of Eisenmenger and others, and it establishes an idea to which the Nazis were themselves heir. And it is this. We have here what is referred to as a tselem, and we have here what is referred to as a tzlav. These two things are not the same. The words don't even sound the same, but I appreciate that orthographically they might look a little bit similar, and semantically they might function similarly in passages. If we're talking about a foreign priest who is carrying a tselem, it could sound like we are talking about a Roman Catholic priest, or we are speaking of a Greek Orthodox priest who is carrying a tzlav. And for reasons that I will elaborate on a little bit later as well, these are not things to which the Talmud itself was ever actually referring, but this mistaken impression, this mistranslation has fostered the idea that the Talmud is critical of Christianity, which it isn't. And I will get back to this a little bit later and demonstrate why I would suggest that the Talmud is not at all critical of Christianity. Let me share with you an example that is actually from the pages of the Stürmer. And to introduce this, let me share with you a particular passage. And the passage is the following one. Shchita kshera bezarim, that the slaughtering of foreigners is kosher. Proof. The Jews allow for the murder of Christian children and the consumption of their blood. This is actually a quote. This line, the slaughtering of foreigners is kosher, is found within the Talmud in Tractate Zvachim. Zvachim deals with the laws relating to the slaughtering of livestock in the temple in Jerusalem. But let's actually have a look at this whole quote. Let's see what it says here. It says that all those who might otherwise be invalidated, who slaughter an animal, their slaughter is kosher. The slaughtering of foreigners, women, slaves, and the impure is kosher. In other words, when a foreigner, who in this context, by the way, is a Jew, who is not a member of the hereditary Israelite priesthood, goes and slaughters an animal in the temple, that slaughter is kosher. In linguistic terms, when we say the slaughtering of foreigners, this is an objective genitive, not a subjective genitive. In other words, it's the foreigners who are doing the slaughtering, not the foreigners who are being slaughtered. But this quote and this idea gets utilized in an edition of the Stürmer that went to print in 1939, known as the Ritual Murder Edition. It features a long article, and I'll share with you a passage from this article, written by Johannes Pohl, demonstrating that Jews allow for the murder of Christian children. You can see an illustration on the front page over here that shows a sort of a piece of medieval iconography depicting Jews slaughtering a Christian child. And there is another similar image on the following page. This one has a caption, and the caption reads, "Ritual murder of the boy Heinrich. In the year 1345, the Jews of Munich slaughtered a non-Jewish boy. The martyr was declared holy by the church." Julius Streicher, who edited this paper, had a particular obsession with these sorts of ideas and mentioned it frequently. So, for example, in a speech that he gave in 1937 when he inaugurated a new bridge, the Wilhelm Gustloff Bridge, which was named after a member of the Nazi Party in Switzerland who had been assassinated by a Swiss Jew. He said that the Jewish textbooks teach that every Jew has the right to kill the non-Jew, and indeed that it is pleasing to the Jewish God to kill as many non-Jews as possible. Okay. Without exploring where is he getting this sort of nonsensical business from, let's actually look at this article. And so we have here an article that was written by Johannes Pohl, and he's quoted a relevant text. Now, Johannes Pohl wrote the article. He quoted the text, he translated the text, he interpreted the text. The only thing that Julius Streicher actually did is typeset it. But let's just take a moment at least to acknowledge that the man who declared himself in Nuremberg to be one of the world's foremost experts on Jews and Judaism managed to print the Aramaic upside down. Here is the relevant part of this text, and all jokes aside, I have to say I am somewhat astonished that Johannes Pohl actually found this text, because Tikkunei Zohar is not an easy-to-find work of literature. It is fairly obscure. And I am legitimately impressed that his independent research has brought him to passages like this one. Here it is in my translation. It says that further, there is the law that the slaughtering of foreigners is valid. This is a Kabbalistic text. This is, by the way, a work of Jewish mysticism. It's not uncommon in texts of this nature that they might play around with quotes, taking them out of context, turning them around. So there is this law that the slaughtering of foreigners is valid, and this is a reference, it says, to people who are likened to beasts in that they do not occupy themselves with Torah law. One needs to offer them as a sacrifice using prayer. What this passage is talking about is Jews who do not observe Torah law, Jews who are not themselves religiously observant, who it is incumbent upon either to pray on their own behalf or for somebody to pray on their behalf, that they might, on some ethereal plane, be considered as a sacrifice. And because they are experiencing death on this spiritual plane, it means that on the earthly plane, they will not face any consequences, any sort of divine retribution from the fact that they are not observing Torah law. Tikkunei Zohar, like other works of Kabbalistic literature, is something of an antinomian text, and this is quite an antinomian idea. Normally texts within the Talmud, for example, place a tremendous emphasis on the observance of the law, but here we have this idea that a Jew who does not observe the law might be in some ethereal sense offered as a sacrifice and not receive divine retribution for their failure to adhere to the laws found within the Torah. Here is how Johannes Pohl translates this same passage. Further, there is a law concerning the slaughter of foreigners who are the same as beasts. This slaughter is to be carried out in a lawfully valid manner. The ones who do not follow the Jewish religious law have to be offered to God as a sacrifice. I refuse to accept that somebody who has the capacity to find a text like Tikkunei Zohar would so egregiously mistranslate it in this way, this has to be a deliberate misconstrual of the passage. He is deliberately interpreting this passage as though it suggests that Jews have a license to go about murdering people who are not Jewish, as absurd as that concept actually is, when he himself clearly has the ability to see what the text itself is actually saying. This is the only other example of a mistranslation that I wish to share with you today. What I really would like to focus on are examples of passages that have been translated well but misinterpreted in some way. And whenever this happens, we always say that the text has been taken out of context. But it's not always that simple, because the reality is there's a lot of different types of contexts from which a text can be taken. And I would like to introduce you to what I'm going to refer to as the 5 contexts of Talmudic text. That first and foremost, we have the passage's immediate literary context. This is normally what people have in mind when they refer to something being taken out of context. The idea that you've quoted a passage, but had you quoted the words immediately prior to it, or the words immediately after it, that would change the way in which we would understand it. We might refer to this, therefore, as the co-text, right? The text around that particular passage. But that's the immediate literary context. When it comes to interpreting texts like that of the Talmud, we also need to be mindful of the broader literary context. So taking a text out of its broader literary context means interpreting it without regard for how terms and phrases within that quote function within the rest of the Talmud. Okay, not being mindful of the ways in which the Talmud operates in terms of its style, in terms of its genre, in terms of its legal norms, and so forth. Now, the Talmud actually contains a variety of different sentiments, a very large number of which are attributed to particular individuals. And the third context is the attributional context. It's important to be mindful of exactly who it is who is quoted as having said something. Okay, and I'll give you an example of this to demonstrate, hopefully, why this might be important. I'll give examples of each one of these misreadings. Then, of course, we have the historical context. What is the text's actual provenance? Okay, obviously, it would make no sense to suggest that the Talmud contains a reference to Napoleon. We appreciate that the Talmud was produced before Napoleon existed, and the same is the case when it comes to suggestions that the Talmud it contains an indictment of Catholicism, for example, or an indictment of I'll share an example with you, actually, to be more precise. Finally, I also want to consider today what I'm going to refer to as the exegetical context. If we want to assert, on the basis of a passage within the Talmud being bizarre or offensive, that the Jews are therefore a bizarre and offensive people, we need to reckon with how has this passage traditionally been interpreted by Jews. It's all well and good to point to something and then to go off on a limb in interpreting it, but how do Jews themselves actually understand these passages and seek to live in accordance with them? So I shall give examples of each of these things, and I'm going to do so in order. And I want to start, therefore, with things that are removed from their immediate literary context. And for obvious reasons, this is a misreading that can only be done deliberately. And here is an example, also from an article written by Johannes Pohl, which features this particular line, a quote from the Shulchan Aruch. It's attributed to Choshen Mishpat, which is one of the 4 divisions of the Shulchan Aruch. And the quote is, Dela amrin and dinab de malchuta, that we do not say that one should follow non-Jewish law, ... He had the integrity at least to include this ellipsis. For if so, all the laws of Israel would be abrogated. Okay, proof, as far as he is concerned, the Jews do not follow the law of the state in which they live. Okay, as the Shulchan Aruch itself clearly says that we do not say that one should follow non-Jewish law, because if we did, all the laws of Israel would be abrogated. But what's he leaving out here? Now, the Shulchan Aruch, I have to say, to the best of my knowledge, even to this day, has never been translated into another language. If you want to read the Shulchan Aruch, you have to read it in Hebrew. So this is not a text that his readers could go and check for themselves. They can't go to a library and read a German translation of the Shulchan Aruch. But if they were to look at the Shulchan Aruch, they would find that the passage in question actually says that we do not say that one should follow non-Jewish law except in cases where it provides benefit to the king or is an edict that concerns all citizens. Okay, so if we're living in a state, we're living in a country, there are laws that affect all of the citizens. We have an obligation to observe those laws. If there's a law that only affects Jews, but it is of benefit to the government, let's say like a special Jew tax that people may have needed to pay, then we need to follow those laws as well. But if we go to our own court, somebody goes to a Jewish court, we do not adjudicate within that court according to foreign law. Because if so, all the laws of Israel would be abrogated. Okay, we live in accordance with the laws of the land, but in our own courts of law, we don't adjudicate in accordance with those laws. It's quite different to what he is suggesting. It's quite different to what he is purporting to quote. Okay, this is a very clear example of taking something out of context. I would like to share another example with you, and this is an example from a film that was produced by Goebbels. It was directed by Fritz Hippler. It's long been a question exactly how involved was Hitler with the production of this film, but it was titled Der ewige Jude, which means the eternal Jew. And I'm going to share this screen, and let's see how the Talmud is quoted.
To understand the serious danger behind all this, it's necessary to look at the moral teachings of the Jewish race. From boyhood, the Jew learns his ancient laws in the Talmud schools. As he grows older, he learns more from the books of Jewish law. But it's not religious instruction. The rabbis are not peaceful theologians, but political educators. The politics of a parasite race must be carried on in secret. The individual ghetto Jew doesn't necessarily have to know all their plans. It's enough that he's filled with the Spirit from youth on. What does the ancient law of the Talmud teach? Always be cunning when afraid. Answer softly to calm the anger of the stranger so that you'll be loved. Ally yourself with him on whom fate smiles at the moment. 5 things Canaan taught his sons: love one another, love pillage, love excess, hate your masters, and never tell the truth.
So what we have within this one short clip is a variety of differing quotes that are supposedly found within the Talmud. I don't know the origins of this clip. Very little of the film in question, Der ewige Jude, was actually filmed for the purpose of this film. There was a lot of stock footage that was employed, and I don't know whether or not this clip was one such piece of stock footage that existed, or whether this was something filmed by a Nazi propagandist, as some of the scenes within the Lodz ghetto were filmed. But one way or another, we have here a short litany of passages, and were the history not so tragic, I would find it rather humorous, I have to say, because the study of the Talmud, a serious engagement with the Talmud, is such an intensely cerebral and intellectual pursuit, here reduced to a variety of little aphorisms, this kind of fortune cookie wisdom, basically, none of which is particularly inoffensive, and whether or not they're actually adapted from passages within the Talmud, I do not know. But the example that I would like to focus on is this one here. There are 5 things that Canaan taught his sons: to love one another, love pillage, love excess, hate your masters, and never tell the truth. And this is indeed a quote from the Talmud. It is found in Tractate Psachim, I am going by the translation that was employed in the dubbed version of the film, though instead of excess, I would myself translate this Hebrew word as promiscuity. Love one another, love pillage, love promiscuity, hate your masters and never tell the truth. And I've been a little perplexed as to which category of misinterpretation to put this. And I've decided that this is a case of removing something from its immediate literary context. But I do so mindful of the fact that the immediate literary context was actually included, it was just not understood. And it's this line here. It's the idea that these are statements that Canaan told his sons. Canaan, pronounced in the dubbed version as Canaan, was one of the sons of Ham, or Ham, who was one of Noah's sons and the brother of Shem. It is the descendants of Shem, the so-called Semites, from where we find the Jews. It is one of the descendants of Shem, who is Abraham, for example, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so forth. Shem's brother Ham is not an ancestor of the Jewish people and is here being described critically. The Talmud is critiquing this notion that one would only love one another, that they would love pillage, that they would love promiscuity, that they would hate their masters and never tell the truth. But it's presented here as a sentiment that the Talmud is actually advocating, based on the individuals in question who produced this film actually having no idea who Canaan was. I want to give an example of some things being removed from its broader literary context, and this is, of course, by definition going to be a little bit more complicated. But the example that I would like to give, aside from being possibly a more complicated example, is also a very sensitive example, and I want to make sure that it is not in any respect misunderstood. And so I would like to start with some remarks that might further help us understand the nature of Talmudic language. And I'm going to make these remarks about the notion of property acquisition. How does one acquire property? Okay, this is a big issue within the Talmud, as it is within any legal code. If we're thinking about how property is acquired, well, practically speaking, it can be purchased. It can be given as a gift. It can be traded as a form of bartering, or it can be signed over by way of a verbal or a written contract. In practical terms, so far as the Talmud is concerned, all of these things being purchased, given as a gift, traded, signed over, this is all part of what we might call the social contract. When it comes to movable objects, as far as the Talmud is concerned, there is one thing, and one thing only, that actually affects the change of ownership, and that is when those objects are taken. If I go into a shop, by way of an example, and I say I would like to purchase this book, and the shopkeeper tells me it's $20, I give the shopkeeper my $20, I do not yet own the book. The book will not yet become mine until such time as I take it. Until that time, both the shopkeeper and I have the ability, legally speaking, to renege on our arrangement. I can decide, actually, I don't want the book anymore. The shopkeeper can decide, actually, he doesn't want to sell me the book anymore. And in both of those situations, needs to return to me the money. The Talmud speaks very critically of those who do not uphold their word. This social contract is very important. We say we're going to buy something, we need to actually buy it. But the acquisition doesn't take place until I take it. So what about theft? What if I don't pay? What if I decide to forego all of that business and just take the book for myself? Now that's an unlawful act. And in such a situation, I do need to compensate for the loss. And I may even need to return that object. Okay, I say often it will involve returning the object, but not always. The reality is, if what I stole is something that depreciates in value, I don't return the object. What I do is I return the value of that object at the time at which I stole it. So if instead of a book, let's say what I stole was a banana, I take the banana home, I put it in my fruit bowl, the next day I'm back in the store and the shopkeeper says to me, hey, you're that guy who stole the banana yesterday. I can't turn around and say to him, okay, I'll bring it back. He doesn't want the banana back. He wants me to pay for it. And in fact, the shopkeeper is legally within his rights, even in the event that what I took was a book. And it has not depreciated at all in value to tell me that he does not want the book back. He wants me to pay for it. And the reason for that is my theft of that object acquired the object. Okay? To repeat, it's not a lawful acquisition. I must compensate the owner. There might be various other ways in which I am penalized as well, but from a legal standpoint, it was my taking of that object that caused that object to pass into my possession. So what kinds of things can be stolen? And the reality is anything that can be owned by another person can also be stolen. So we can steal, for example, real estate, one can steal movable objects, one can even steal ideas. Things that do not have an owner cannot be stolen. So if I'm walking down the street and I see a $50 note on the footpath in a crowded thoroughfare, this is an object that does not have an owner. I cannot steal it. That doesn't mean I cannot take it. Money that is found in a public space, the no identifying marks on it by which it might be returned, that is money that a person can take, but they cannot steal it because the taking of that money does not constitute theft. By the same token, one cannot steal leaves from a forest, one cannot steal water from the ocean, one cannot steal air from the sky, one cannot steal an opinion. One can steal livestock. Now, somebody who is tuning in only at this moment and sees that I have declared that one can steal livestock may very well go home and say, hey, you know what this Jewish Talmud says? It says that you are allowed to steal livestock. It says absolutely no such thing. It says you can steal livestock. Saying that you can steal livestock is another way of simply saying that livestock is an object that can theoretically be stolen. That if you take livestock without permission, we call it theft. It is called stealing. As for this question whether or not one is allowed to steal, well, the answer is clearly and emphatically and unambiguously no. Theft is against the law. Theft is always and by definition against the law. But it is possible. And not only is theft possible, it can affect a change of ownership. So here is another way that we can say the same thing. We can say you can steal an object. Theft is a valid mode of acquisition. Saying that you can steal an object does not mean that you are allowed to steal an object because you are not. It just means from a legal standpoint, theft of an object is possible. Saying that it is a valid mode of acquisition does not mean that it is a lawful mode of acquisition, for it is not. It is valid only in as much as legally it affects a change of ownership. Compensation needs to be paid, perhaps the object itself needs to be returned, or may even need to be confiscated. But it has, from a legal standpoint, affected for that time an actual change of ownership. What I would like to speak about, the example that I would like to give, has to do with marriage. Marriage is understood in the Talmud as a commercial transaction. In the world of the Talmud, it was conceived as a man's acquisition of a wife. Now, there is a question. Exactly how is a woman acquired? And the Talmud says that she is acquired in one of three ways. Either with money, with a contract, or through sexual intercourse. These are the three different ways that a man might acquire a wife. The Talmud goes on to suggest clearly and unambiguously that the third of these is absolutely forbidden. That marrying somebody through sexual intercourse is considered a form of licentiousness. It is considered a sinful act. Nonetheless, it is legally possible. Nonetheless, it affects a marriage, even if it is forbidden. Our practice today is to do both of the first two. So a man will give his bride an object that is worth money. Traditionally, we use a ring. And there will also be a contract that we call a ketubah. The Talmud goes into a lot of detail discussing details relating to this object that is worth money. Okay, how much money should it be worth? What kind of objects? What happens if he owns the object but it is currently leased out to somebody else? What happens if he's using this object for collateral for a loan that he owes to another person? What are the different ways that he might give it to her? What are situations that might render the giving of this object legally doubtful? And so on and so forth. And the Talmud does this also when it comes to laws relating to the contract. What information should the contract say? Does the contract need to be written with the intention that is given to this particular couple who are valid witnesses for the signing of this contract, and so on and so forth? Because the Talmud is the Talmud, it also invests no small amount of space in discussing all of the laws relating to the third of these, marriage by way of sexual intercourse, even though it's forbidden. Even though it is against the law, nonetheless, because it is legally effective, the Talmud has to discuss what constitutes sexual intercourse? What constitutes a sexual act for the purposes of effecting a marriage? And, of course, with whom? Who could be considered, legally speaking, a partner to this sexual act? So one of the things that the Talmud wants to describe is the point at a person's life at which they become physiologically capable of engaging in a sexual act. Now, based on whatever medical or physiological information the authors of the Talmud had, they conclude that for the male in the relationship, that he needs be at least 9 years of age. Prior to the age of 9, he is not held to be physiologically capable of committing a sexual act. But for the female party to the relationship, because her involvement in the act might be more passive, it was understood that from a physiological perspective, she needs to be only of the age of 3. This is the reason why the Talmud declares that one can marry a 3-year-old girl through sexual intercourse. I want to be very clear about what I'm suggesting here. Saying that one can do this does not mean that one is allowed to do this. In fact, one is forbidden from doing this, even were she 23 years of age. The whole phenomenon that is being described here is an illegal phenomenon. It is against the law. You are not allowed to do this, but it is legally effective. And the Talmud, in terms of setting parameters on their understanding of this law, declares that it becomes legally effective from the age of 3. When Alfred Rosenberg quotes this in 1920, saying that one may have sexual intercourse with a 3-year-old girl, according to the Talmud, he is removing this passage from its broader literary context. Suggesting that one is allowed to do this is a complete and egregious misinterpretation. When he goes further and suggests that the Talmud actually encourages this kind of behavior, that the Talmud encourages pedophilia, he's making something up. And proof to the fact that he is making something up lies in the fact that in the long history of anti-Talmudic polemic, nobody before Alfred Rosenberg had ever thought to make this particular allegation. What is most regrettable is that the allegation has grown legs, you might say, and continues to be repeated, and is a difficult one for many people to refute if they are not familiar with the Talmud's broader literary context, that they do not understand how language is being employed. When the Talmud says that one can do something, it does not mean that one is allowed to. Oftentimes it is distinctly forbidden. They are setting parameters on the legislation and understanding what is possible, what is in this case physiologically possible from a legal perspective. I would like to give another example of this, and it's an example that comes from an exhibit that Joseph Goebbels put on. The title of which was the same as the title of the film that was produced a couple of years later, Der ewige Jude, The Eternal Jew. And this is an exhibit that started in 1937, was so popular, in fact at one stage there were 5,000 people coming every day, that it continued into 1938, when after the Anschluss it was taken to Austria. And if you look here at the way that this exhibit is being advertised, you can see that some of the sorts of things that people are learning about is this connection between Judaism and communism, and this sort of relationship that Jews have with money, and so forth. One of the exhibits was manned by Julius Streicher, and featured this particular illustration, an illustration that he also used in 1938 in a book that he published titled Der Giftpilz, which means the poison mushroom. In the book, which was for children, this and other illustrations is accompanied with a short story. And in this case, it's a story that concerns a young boy by the name of Solly, depicted here, who is preparing for his bar mitzvah and is taking instruction from a rabbi as regards things that it says in the Talmud. And the quote at the bottom of this reads that in the Talmud it is written, "Only the Jew is human. The non-Jewish peoples are not human beings, they are therefore likened to cattle. Since we Jews see non-Jews as animals, we call them only goy." This last part, of course, is just a bit of nonsense, because the word goy means nation. The Jewish people are also described as a goy. In the Bible, they are referred to as a goy kadosh, which means a holy nation or a nation set apart. When we talk about the Goyim, as in the nations of the world, we are referring to all of those non-Israelite nations, all of those non-Jewish peoples of the world. There is no relationship between that word and any word meaning livestock. But I want to focus just on the quote. Only the Jew is human. The non-Jewish peoples are not human beings. They are therefore likened to cattle. And this is an interesting example of where passage is removed from its broader literary context. It's also removed from its immediate literary context, and it's also partly made up. Okay, this business about non-Jewish people being likened to cattle is a fabrication. Okay, there is no such quote within the Talmud. But I want to focus really on this first part, this idea that not only the Jew is human, the non-Jewish peoples are not human beings. And here is the quote in question, which you can see in Tractate Kritos, Atem kroyin Adam, the you are called people, Ve'ein ha'ovdei kochavim kroyin Adam, but idolaters are not called people. So why exactly is this a case of removing something from the broader literary context? To give a little bit of immediate context for this, what the passage is talking about here is a passage within the Mishnah that speaks of an oil, a particular type of oil of anointment that was manufactured for use in the temple. And it had to be used only on objects and certain people, like the high priest, within the temple. If a person were to use that oil for their own mundane purposes, then they would be subject to a penalty called karet, which means like a kind of spiritual excision. The Mishnah says, however, that if a person who is not Jewish, if, to use the Mishnah's terminology, an idolater were to use it for their own mundane purposes, there is no penalty. What the Talmud wants to understand is, why is there no penalty? Why are they also not penalized for this? When I suggest that this is an example of removing something from its broader literary context, it's an example of where it is helpful to know aspects of Talmudic style, aspects of the way in which the Talmud speaks. The Talmud does not presume to make ontological statements. Okay, the Talmud is not suggesting that certain people are not human beings, okay, as absurd as that idea might be. It is instead seeking to find a scriptural rationalization for a law within the Mishnah. If the Mishnah says that a non-Jewish person is not subject to any penalty as a result of misappropriating this type of oil that was used within the temple, then maybe there can be a scriptural basis for this. Maybe when the passage that forbids a person's using it for themselves uses the word Adam, we can take this as a code that whenever it uses the word Adam, it refers only to Jewish people. It does not refer to non-Jewish people. Okay, the Talmud has a propensity to view the Torah, the written Torah, as a kind of elaborate code. It looks for ways in which words function. Okay, again, not to make an ontological claim as regards the physical essence, the physical identity of a person, but instead to suggest that every time the Talmud uses the word Adam, it might be a reference to Jewish people exclusively. Okay, every time the Torah, I beg your pardon, uses the word Adam, it is a reference to Jewish people exclusively. But I would also like to suggest that this is an example of removing a passage from its immediate literary context. Because if we look at this, we find that straight away the Talmud goes on to say, well, hold on a moment, in the book of Numbers, it refers to the Midianites, who were not Jewish, who were not Israelites themselves. It refers to the Midianites, and it uses the word Adam to refer to them as well. And the Talmud goes on to say, and also in the book of Jonah, when it refers to the non-Jewish people who live in Nineveh, the city within the Assyrian Empire that God has decided to destroy, it also uses the word Adam to refer to them as well. And ultimately the Talmud suggests, oh, here's an alternative explanation of the Mishnah. Okay, we've tried one explanation of the Mishnah. We've asserted that perhaps the Mishnah is not imposing a penalty on non-Jewish people for misappropriating this particular item because it's only an Adam who can misappropriate it, and every time the Torah uses the word Adam, it is restricting itself only to Jewish people, to the exclusion of non-Jewish people. But having exhausted that particular idea, the Talmud now offers an alternative explanation instead. Ignoring not only the immediate literary context, but the broader literary context enabled then those Nazi propagandists to make this absurd claim that the Talmud is suggesting that non-Jewish people are in some sense not actually human beings. And they go further, of course, with that claim. by suggesting that therefore the Talmud encourages any act of violence or robbery against non-Jewish people. And of course it is one of the great ironies of this, that the same things that they are inventing about Jewish people, they are themselves responsible for when it comes to others. That they themselves see non-Aryans as non-human, that they themselves legitimize widespread robbery, treating people like cattle, murdering people en masse. But in the process are inventing this allegation that it is actually Jews who are saying these sorts of things about them. I'd like to give an example of where the attributional context is relevant. And the example that I'm going to give is from the same film that I made reference to previously, Der ewige Jude, the Eternal Jew. There is a scene immediately after the scene that I shared a moment ago that takes place within a synagogue. The synagogue in question was the Vilka synagogue in Lodz. Germans arrived at Lodz. They made the local kehillah, the local community, open up the synagogue, which had previously been closed within the ghetto. They brought a number of people in. All of them men. They had them go through the motions. It was a Tuesday morning. Had them go through the motions, performing parts of the synagogue service, reading from the Torah, and so forth. It's one of the very few scenes that was actually filmed by German propagandists for inclusion within the film. And while the Torah reader is reading from the Torah, the voiceover announces some of the sorts of things the one encounters in works of Jewish law. And they quote what sound to be references to passages in the Shulchan Aruch and a passage from the Haggadah, which gets read on Pesach. But there are actually amalgamations of different things taken from the Talmud and taken from the Siddur, from the Hebrew liturgy. And one of those statements, not in so many words, but it certainly underpins some of the statements that they suggest, is this idea that non-Jewish people are all of them idolaters, that they are all of them practitioners of idolatry. And anybody who is really familiar with Jewish law will know themselves that that's not true, that Jewish law does not suggest that all non-Jewish peoples are practitioners of idolatry. But this is a quote. And the quote is Stam machshevet nochri lavodah zara, which is that when it comes to a nochri, which means a foreigner, somebody who is not Jewish, their basic thought, the basis of all of their intentions is idolatry. What is not being included here is, I think, a very important piece of information, which is that this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Now, why might that be relevant? Aside from the fact that it's important to know who exactly is saying what, somebody who is familiar with the Mishnah and with the Talmud will know that there are a number of passages in which Rabbi Eliezer is himself quoted as saying things that are quite extreme. He has attributed to him views that go well beyond the views of his contemporaries. Okay, his views relating to educating one's daughters, for example, are the most extreme views that are recorded. That one shouldn't even teach one's daughters the Torah. Okay, is something that Rabbi Eliezer says. And I'll share, just to give you an example, I will share with you a quote actually from the Mishnah when Rabbi Eliezer's student, Rabbi Akiva, is accosted by a few other students who ask him a question. They say to him, "Did not Rabbi Eliezer say, the one who eats bread baked by Samaritans is as one who eats the flesh of pigs?" This extreme and outlandish view. Did Rabbi Eliezer say this? And Rabbi Akiva's response to them, I think, is quite telling. He says, "Shtoku, quiet, silence. I will not tell you what Rabbi Eliezer said on this matter." That he wishes to defend his teacher, who we are given to understand, for reasons that are not at all clear, was subject to a rabbinic ban and ended up living the rest of his days in isolation from the other rabbis and from the seat of a rabbinic jurisdiction. This man who was renowned for making statements of an outlandish or a controversial nature, is it not relevant then to appreciate that if we're quoting a passage from the Mishnah that seems extreme, that it should be a statement that was made by him? And this brings me, of course, to the fourth example of contextualization, which is what I am referring to here as the historical context. If we want to know what a text might have meant, it is important to be mindful of the fact that every text is the product of a human being. Every human being is the product of the time and the place in which they lived. If we're thinking about the Talmud, and I will restrict this to the Talmud specifically, we are thinking then about the Mishnah, which is that code of Jewish law on which the Talmud is predicated. And we are thinking about what is known as the Gemara, which is the Talmudic amplification and elaboration and discussion of the Mishnah. And when it comes to the Mishnah, we are talking about something that was produced in Palestine, in Roman Palestine, in the 3rd century of the Common Era, okay, around about the year 200 to 220. The dominant non-Jewish culture was Hellenistic. The power, you might say, the authority was Roman, and the object of antagonism were sectarians, not Christians, but Jewish Christians. Okay, the Talmud as a whole cares very little for Christians and Christianity, but inasmuch as Christianity was initially a Jewish sect, inasmuch as there were Jewish Christians, there is an object of antagonism there. Those Jews who had, in the view of those rabbis, abandoned Judaism, who had strayed beyond the path of what they conceived of as a legitimate Judaism, the object of antagonism within the Mishnah. They're called minim, which means sectarians. In the Talmud, in the Gemara, in this elaboration of the Mishnah and the Tosefta, we have a text that is produced in Persia and Babylonia. It continues to be added to and edited after the 6th century, but the 6th century marks a bit of a cutoff in terms of the ideas that are presented within this literature. The dominant non-Jewish culture is Zoroastrianism. Okay, whenever the Talmud refers to foreign priests, it is talking about Zoroastrian priests. The power is that of Sassanid Persia, okay, that's who holds the political authority within the world in which the Talmud is produced, and Christianity, as now a non-Jewish religion, is of absolutely zero concern. If there are passages that appear to mock Jesus and his disciples, there's a small number of passages that have been excised by censors. It is only inasmuch as Jesus and his disciples were themselves Jews. And there is, as we find within the Mishnah as well, this antipathy towards sectarianism within the Jewish faith. Inasmuch as Christianity, beyond that, is a non-Jewish religion, the Talmud itself has profoundly no interest. And Christians, incidentally, were also a religious minority at the time of the Talmud. But let me give you an example. And it's an example actually also from the film that I referenced before, the Ewige Jude, in the synagogue scene. One of those quotes that is itself an amalgamation of a number of different quotes attributed to the Talmud is this statement that the best of all non-Jews should be killed. Okay, and this is actually a statement that was attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and it is found, its source is in a midrash on the book of Exodus called Mechilta. And I'll give the context actually because I think it's quite an interesting midrash. It's in relation to the Israelites having fled Egypt and now pursued by the Pharaoh and all of his chariots that are being pulled by horses. And the midrash asks, where do these horses come from? Because we are told explicitly within the Torah that all of the Egyptian livestock was killed during the plagues. The midrash suggests, look, it can't be the Pharaoh's own private stock of horses, because the Torah also seemed to be explicit that the Pharaoh's livestock was also wiped out during the plague as well. And it can't be the Israelites' horses, because the Torah tells us that the Israelites brought all of their livestock with them. So the Midrash concludes somewhat creatively that these horses must have belonged to God-fearing Egyptians, that they belonged to Egyptians who believed what Moses had said, who feared the Lord, who feared the Israelite God, and who brought all of their horses inside to protect them from the plagues that otherwise wiped out all of the Egyptian livestock. And it's on the basis of this that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says that if even the God-fearing Egyptians ultimately gave their horses in pursuit of the Jews, that they might chase them down and return them to slavery, that the best of all non-Jews should be killed. Okay, that's the exegetical basis behind this. But we have to think a little bit about the historical context in which this statement is initially given expression. Okay, it is a statement, by the way, that already in the time of the Talmud, there is some degree of exegetical discomfort about. So in Tractate Sofrim, for example, which is a late tractate of the Talmud, there's additional words. Okay, the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says that the best of all non-Jews in a time of war should be killed. And that reflects for the Talmud what was already becoming an uncomfortable sentiment. But who was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and when did he live? So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was one of the students of Rabbi Akiva, whom I mentioned before, himself a student of Rabbi Eliezer. And he lives in the 2nd century. And if we think about some of the things that are happening during this time, there were 3 major revolts against the Romans. Okay, the first of those revolts, known as the Great Revolt, described by Josephus and a variety of Roman sources, resulted in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the destruction also of the Sanhedrin, which was the sort of the seat of jurisprudence within Jerusalem. And the capturing of a variety of sacred objects within the temple, depicted here, for example, in the Arch of Titus. There was a second revolt. And the second revolt occurred around 115 to 117 and is known as the Kitos War. It's a series of revolts that broke out as a result of which a number of Jewish revolutionaries were publicly executed. But the greatest of all of these revolts, the largest of all of these revolts, and one during which Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and various other sages of his generation lived, was the third and last of these revolts, known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt. The Bar Kokhba Revolt resulted in such a tremendously widespread desolation of the landscape that the presence of ruins, these variety of different ruined structures, is a core feature of the background in a number of different Talmudic narratives. It resulted in a tremendous loss of life, a huge increase in the number of Jews who were then kidnapped and sold into slavery in various other parts of the Roman Empire, and in a lot of ways really marks the last time that the Jewish people themselves ever revolted against an occupying power until the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in the year 1943. So great was the desolation that was caused as a result of the Bar Kokhba Revolt that in terms of Jewish history, we continue to treat this period between the festivals of Passover and Tabernacles, or Pesach and Shavuot, as a period of mourning in recollection of the destruction that had ensued. And statements like this one that are made by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, this idea that the best of all non-Jews, whether in a time of war or not in a time of war, this idea that the best of them should be killed, is a statement that is born of the historical circumstances in which he lived. But if we want any indication that this is not a sentiment by which Jewish people live, well, we can actually look at the very same page of the Talmud in which this here is recorded. That slightly earlier within this discussion, Rabbi Yehuda is quoted as suggesting that the best of all doctors is destined for hell. And that's an interesting one, given the long history in more recent years of Jewish practitioners of medicine. In fact, at the time of the Nazis in the Third Reich, prior to their having come to power, in as much as Jews were overrepresented in commerce, they were staggeringly overrepresented within the medical profession. They made up less than 1% of all of the population of Germany, but over 10% of all of the German doctors. As a result of which, the Nazis continually alleged that Jews were taking over the medical profession in some capacity. So this idea, this sort of Talmudic antagonism towards practitioners of medicine is clearly not something that is actually reflected in normative Jewish practice. And I think that's an important thing to be mindful of, that a sentiment that is found within the Talmud is by no means ever uncritically adopted by later generations of Jews. And this also brings us, of course, to the final point that I want to make, which is removing something from its exegetical context. If we wish to draw conclusions as regards the sentiment of Jews today, we need to reckon with how Jews today read these passages within the Talmud. And I'll share one example with you, and we're going to finish with Johannes Pohl. Johannes Pohl wrote an article. I actually quoted this article earlier as well, as a matter of fact. And in this particular instance, he's quoting the Talmud in Tractate Nedarim. And he declares, or the Talmud itself declares, that if one wishes for all of his vows of the year to be nullified, the vows that he has not yet made, if for the year coming he wants them all to be nullified, then he must declare at the beginning of the year, all vows that I vow shall be void, but only if he thinks of this at the time of the vow. It's a very controversial passage, and it's generated a tremendous amount of discussion, and it is the origin for the custom of singing Kol Nidre, which means all vows, at the beginning of Yom Kippur. It's a very beautiful passage, and it tends to be sung traditionally in a very beautiful, very almost operatic way. It's a controversial passage in as much as it requires some measure of understanding to interpret what is going on here. When we're talking about retroactively nullifying vows, we don't mean oaths that are made within a court of law. We mean vows between a person and God. Okay, that if a person were to take a vow upon themselves that they vow not to eat any fruit, for example, or not to consume meat, and they know that they might be prone to making rash vows of this nature, something of which the Talmud is very critical, that there is a little bit of an escape clause, and there are various circumstances under which such an escape clause might work, as it is stipulated here in a very terse format. One cannot conclude anything from this as regards the untrustworthiness of Jews when it comes to promises that they make to other people or to oaths that they make in a court of law. Doing so would be interpreting this without any attention given to the ways in which Jews have traditionally understood this particular passage. So this has been, in brief, just a little bit of an overview as to the various ways in which German propagandists within the Third Reich used and abused passages from the Talmud and related literature. And as we've seen, there's a real kind of hierarchy here that at the bottom of which we have passages that are invented altogether that serve really just as a reflection of the propagandists' views as regards Jews and Judaism. We've seen a few instances of things that have been mistranslated. But what we have also seen is a number of different things that have in some sense been taken out of context, some of which I am prepared to believe was done guilelessly, that with a certain degree of unfamiliarity, with one is not understanding of this literature, which can be fairly complex, fairly abstruse, one can make all manner of different mistakes. But certainly some of these errors are willful errors that are made with the intention of deceiving the individuals who are responsible for reading this passage. I hope that this has been of interest to people. Certainly it's a topic that I find myself somewhat fascinated by, the various ways in which rabbinic literature can be willfully or unwillfully misconstrued. Sadly, the reality is many of these misinterpretations that are made by Nazi propagandists have outlived them somewhat and continue to proliferate online, to which all that I can say is that the Talmud and other examples of rabbinic literature are now thankfully, thanks to the internet, more broadly available, and those who are interested can certainly find them and certainly find a great many of them in translation as well. Thank you.